A Family History by Gabriel Knight Asper.
Who am I? Where do I come from? These are all questions that everybody should ask themselves. One legacy that I carry from my mom's side of the family is her last name, Knight, her maiden name. I have always been proud of this last name. It means a lot to me, and I understand where my family comes from.
My mom's side of the family immigrated from Alderney, one of the Channel Islands between England and France,
In the late 1800s.
I get my middle name, Knight, from this family. My great-grandfather, William John Knight, is descended from William Edward Knight, who was a farmer on Alderney. William John worked most of his life in rock quarries on the island. In the late 1800s, William John Knight and his wife, Helena Seymour Bott, came to the United States for the first time. They lived in Detroit, Michigan, and in 1910, my grandfather, William Edward Knight, was born. My grandfather was known to be a very compassionate man, and he was a pillar of his community. He passed away from brain cancer in 1974.
When faced with the question of who am I can't help but to think that my grandfather is an important part of me. From the stories that I have heard, I have realized that it was always the small things that made my grandfather a great man, a big fish, so to speak. These stories are always short and fleeting because I never met him myself, but they carry a lot of meaning. One story is that in Emily City, whenever anybody found a stray animal, they would bring it to my grandfather's dime store and leave it on the steps, knowing that he would take care of it. Another story is that my grandfather would keep his store open late some nights so that the minority workers could come there and not feel racial treatment from the townspeople. Because I never met him, the question that I have asked myself today is who was my grandfather? What was his life like? What is his life story? What does he mean to me?
My grandpa William was known as a caring and a responsible man. He had to drop out of high school 2 times in his young adulthood to get a job to help support his family. He met my grandma Ruth when he was 14 years old at a church camp. My grandpa never went to college, and he was 20 years old when he finally finished high school. Right after high school, my grandfather was already employed for a company called the Kresge Company, which later on evolved into Kmart. My grandparents were married in 1930 when my grandfather was 22. He was already employed, and they rarely saw each other in those first years of marriage. My mom says that my grandparents moved 8 times in 8 years from states as diverse as Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, etc. My grandparents had 4 children: Ruth, Julie, Mary, my mom, and Bill. After working for the Kresge Company, my grandfather got tired of moving around so much, and he moved to Marine City, Michigan, and opened a 5 and dime. He had to get a loan from the bank, and he had a partner. After some years of managing the Marine City store, my grandfather turned the reins over to his brother Clarence, who took over the management of the store. In 1944, Grandpa William Edward moved to Emily City, Michigan to manage a 5 and dime store called DeLong's 5-cent to a dollar store. My grandfather, William Edward, didn't much like working for Mr. DeLong, who was the owner of DeLong's 5-cent to a dollar store. But in 1954, finally, Mr. DeLong sold the store to my grandfather. Later in the store's history, my grandfather turned it into a Benjamin Franklin store.
My grandfather raised 4 amazing kids who all had kids of their own. My mom always describes him as one of the best people that she's ever known, one of the most amazing men. I believe in my heart that he truly was a great man and that he's responsible for who I am today. He inspires me to be a good person, to be responsible, to always do my best, and not to judge other people.